Legacy of a King, a Legacy Series novel by Charlene Sponsel. Chapter 2, A Promise, 33rd day of fall, 446. A half cycle passed, and every day the weight on my father's shoulders grew heavier. When an invitation arrived for me, I ran through the darkened marketplace. The Cantonex invited me to the entitlement ceremony. I'll do better this time, I promise. I twirled, grinding my tattered shoes in the dirt. Until then, I had forgotten about the Vinland boys' claim. May I make a new ensemble? We must rent a carriage and pay for your accommodations. My father wrung his work-worn hands. I will pull some old stock, and you may work on it after you finish your chores. His face was pensive. What is it, father? Word arrived from Melange. Queen Varin has passed. A cry erupted from me. My chest tightened, and I pressed my hands to it as if it would help. I must go to the interment. It's too expensive, and you need to attend the Cantonex ceremony. Please. It would be a frivolous venture. Go check if cook needs help with dinner. But my father didn't come home for dinner that night, or the next. Instead, he worked long hours to pay for attending the upcoming event. The sun set well before I finished my chores, but it didn't deter me from working on my ensemble in front of the fire. Elix's mouth twisted in disgust at my design. Are you going to add knee pads to this one? I turned my back to him. You're wasting money to gather scorn on our family name, and I don't mean what they'll say, though that won't be good either. They're going to see you and assume you're one of the staff. Take it back, Elix, I snapped at him. You'll be the fool again. Father said I have a good eye. Our argument came to an abrupt halt as my father unbolted the door. Cheap liquor hung around him like a cloud as he sat at his desk, ignored our bickering, and opened his books. I went to my room, or rather, what I called a room. Threadbare cloth formed walls, providing me some privacy. It had been for my parents. Little had changed since my mother died, but our home was no longer warm. The unvarnished red wood and dingy bay walls were suffocating reminders. Their room was a privilege that set me apart from Elix, as was the tear-stained mattress. Stuffed with leaves, it crinkled as I moved and gave off a musty smell, but it was better than the grass mats Elix and my father slept on in the common room. I had a feather blanket as well, a unification gift my parents received from my grandparents. Their lone possession to survive the war. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and buried my face. The queen was dead. I imagined my mother stroking my back and saying, Don't be hard on your father. His hopes are on you. It's difficult for him. He's accustomed to providing for his family. I didn't remember her voice, but the fabrication comforted me. It also increased my misery because I wasn't the only one missing their mother that night. Breakfast was on the table when I emerged the next morning, but even the savory sautéed mushrooms didn't whet my appetite. I pushed the omelet around my plate with disinterest, while Elix devoured his food. This arrived for you. My father thrust a letter toward me. I brushed my fingers over the bumpy surface of the thick paper where my name was written in silver leaf, and flipped it over to see the broken indigo seal. Whose is this? The Queen's. But how is that possible? My father shook his head. This is an invitation to the interment. My father's face was blank. It says a carriage will arrive in 2 days. May I go, father? You must. He stared at the paper. It's her dying wish. What? Elix snorted and banged his fists on the table. I drummed my feet on the reed-covered floor and ignored Elix's protest. Who will escort me, I asked, breathing in the sweet herbs my feet had disturbed. I will. But, father, she will make a fool of us, Elix shouted. The matter is settled, Elix. Elix stomped out of the cottage, muttering his displeasure. Thank you, Papa. Papa? He snapped out of his preoccupation. You haven't called me Papa since you started school. Finish your ensemble, and I will find something special for it. 2 days later, we bumped along Cantoneck Road, headed for Melange. High-reaching snowy trunks and crimson leaves of caracat trees shrank away with the ice-capped Cantiga Mountains. Vinland stretched to the horizon, an endless barrier that lay between my home and Alonji Castle. The pleasantness of the journey caused me to forget the terrible purpose of our trip. Now, I believe my father knew it would be our last. The road winding into the crowded square was thick with manure. I may have believed it was no longer cobblestone if not for the jolting of the carriage. I covered my nose with the edge of my wool cloak, shielding it from the moist scent. We moved toward the inn, hampered by carriages and merchants calling out their wares. Visitors bustled through the dusty streets and tunneled alleyways, darkened by overhanging second stories. Walking might have been faster, but my father said those were the conditions that caused accidents. I wouldn't argue. It was how my mother died. My father checked us in at the front desk of the inn. Anyone with a spare room rented it out. There isn't a vacancy anywhere. Fortunate that the Queen had the foresight to reserve accommodations for us. I wondered how she managed it as I laid in the strange bed, unable to sleep with the noises of the city outside the tidy private room. Loud men drinking their breakfast woke me. The crowd gathering in the square below my window had more gaiety than I could rally. Father was right. No one would notice my presence. I donned the new ensemble with none of my usual excitement. What had I expected? Why did the Queen bother? I wanted to cry as I descended the stairs to join my father. He scrutinized my design. What a shame it isn't for a more pleasant occasion. Take off your cloak, he said, and produced a silk cape from behind his back. The cloth was the perfect shade, and my fingers slipped into the folds of its smooth surface. It's too much, Father. I said I would find something special. Let me worry about the expense. We ate, though I had no stomach for the small ration. When it was time, my father offered his arm and patted my hand as we stepped onto the cobblestone street. I shielded my face from the brightness of the sun and trudged with hundreds of mourners toward the city center. They had swept the square clean, and straw lay on the path the sovereign family would walk, leaving the air fresh. My father and I edged through the crowd until we reached the ropes lining the walkway from the castle gate to the burial chamber. The irreverent crowd acted like they were waiting for a parade. Only as the litter came within view did they quiet. As the king escorted his mate one last time, the crowd tossed indigo petals. They fell like rain, embodying the tears of undying adoration for their queen, who lay on a silk pillow, sunlight flashing off her blue-silver crown. White gossamer veils hid the faces of the sovereign family, and a sheer cloth opaque enough to imagine the woman she was before bouts of sickness laid waste to her body covered the queen. Princess Belia followed, her infant son in her arms, Queen Varin's grandson, who she would never know. A steady stream of tears wet my cheeks, for the queen and the family left to grieve as they made their first journey home without her. Mourners convened in taverns to drink and play games of chance while children ran wild in the streets as if it were a holiday. After an hour of waiting for a table at the inn, my father received a message. I continued to survey the room for an empty seat, assuming it was one of his contacts. "Come, Lili. We are to pay our respects," he said. "At the castle?" "Where else?" We rode down the southern streets where statuesque manors bordered the river. Rows of shabby buildings with thatched roofs lined the worn dirt roads to the north, with bedraggled children sitting on the stoops. We passed through a stone gate that hid them from view, and Alonji Castle's 4 towers, crowned with teeth-like embattlements, rose 6 stories high on the shore of Elon Lake. Slow-moving guests had traveled from every corner of western Hanukkah to offer their condolences to the sovereign family, who stood unveiled at the head of the great hall. The room was free of the decorations it had borne for Varin's entitlement. Queen Varin's name echoed against the cold stone in whispers that moved through the crowd like a presence. King Tali acknowledged no one, but stared, unseeing, with dead green eyes. Princess Belia thanked guests for their sentiments, while her mate Destil stood like a brick wall behind her with their infant son in his arms. He was shorter than the others, blonde with orange highlights and shading. My mind shuffled through a stream of options. I crossed off those expressed by others until I stood at the foot of the king. My mind went blank. I panicked and said the first thing that came to mind. It's not right without her here. Iliota, my father scolded. King Tali, I kneeled. I'm sorry. Sweat pricked at my forehead as I stammered through the apology. I didn't mean... The king extended his hand, quieting me. It is the first accurate sentiment anyone has offered. Princess Belia glared at me, then averted her gaze and refused to take my hand. I greeted the others in silence, too afraid of what else I would say. The recently titled Duke of Majorca, Farin, stood at attention next to his sister. He was hard as diamond, shaped and polished in his officer's uniform. Next to him was his other sister, Kesma, who wouldn't receive her title for another cycle when she turned 15. She nodded to me like a delicate flower. I'd love to emulate that. Budding green shaded her velvety olive skin and created the shape of a heart around her gentle face. Kamek held my hand longer than necessary, with his eyebrows scrunched together over questioning glossy green eyes. Entitled continued filing into the ballroom, while my father and I followed the line of commoners to the dining hall. I wasn't hungry, but I ate and gulped sour wine while listening to the music. The quick beat of hollow notes sounded sourful in the company of droning strings. A family portrait painted when King Tali and Queen Varin were first appointed at the conclusion of the war hung over the fireplace and held my attention. The king was the same, despite the war ending before I was old enough to remember. The queen stood behind him. She was full of life, with vibrant violet shading adorning the smooth curves of her face and collarbones. I barely recognized her. A black-cloaked Everforester approached our table while we ate. Niall of Wesselder? Yes. Follow me, and bring the child. We followed the man to the 4th floor of the castle. His black cloak floated behind him, reminding me of another worn by the man who'd been so informal with the queen, and I bit my lip as alarm rang in my ears. My father showed no concern, neither did he appear surprised. Wait inside, he ordered, opening the double doors. The room emanated citrus oil and leather. On one side was a small, unlit fireplace. On the other, an imposing desk and bookshelves made of dark wood. Positioned in the corners were 2 full suits of armor with weaponry. Through the open doors stepped the frightening man who had stood next to the staircase at Farin's entitlement. His shoulders were broad, and he was tall, even for an Everforester. A severe scar crossed his brow and extended to his earlobe, which gave his unattractive face a menacing feature. His demeanor demanded respect. My father bowed, and I followed his example with a curtsy. I'm Sitak, Elderman of Majorca, brother of King Tali, and his most trusted counsel. My father and I lowered ourselves again in deference. The king has been despondent since the queen passed. In fact, your daughter is the first person to whom he has spoken. He paused, and my muscles twitched, eager to remove myself from his presence. I have the authority to offer her a place here. His confident, stern tones said the choice was not ours. That is generous, my father smiled knowingly. May I ask what position you are giving her? She will be King Tali's companion. He sat behind the desk. To begin without delay. His companion. She is a child. It is more common in Majorca than in Wesselder. She will remain here, and when she matures... You want a unification contract? He asked in disbelief. The elderman's implacable stare challenged him. My father grew quiet, and he regarded me before stepping between us. With respect, no. We thank you for the consideration. I didn't comprehend what the elderman asked of me, and tugged at my father's arm. Why would he reject it? His glare quieted me. You would deny your commoner daughter a chance to be queen? The elderman's voice reverberated. My commoner daughter, as you ungraciously stated it, is 3 cycles from entitlement, and the king is more than twice her age, my father said with more bravery than I knew he possessed. I couldn't help but be proud. The alderman stared at him with slit eyes. "If this is a ploy to negotiate better terms—" "Father," I muttered, trembling as the alderman focused on me and dipped his chin. "Leave us," my father told me without removing his gaze from the alderman. It was a side of him I'd never seen, one that must have served him well as a tradesman. I backed from the room, and the double doors shut, darkening the empty hall and muting their voices. The fourth floor had none of the luxury and decadence the 3 levels below boasted. It was as bleak and intimidating as the alderman. I lowered myself to the floor, waiting in the same pose I had when the king first approached me. What would it be like to call the castle home one day? "Lili," the door burst open, disturbing my pondering, and my father's form emerged as a shadow. "You are staying. Now?" It hit me like a winter wind in the middle of summer. My stomach sank as I righted myself. "I won't trouble you with the details." My father's false confidence disappeared as the sentence came out in pieces. "We'll be taken care of, and your future is secure. I'll have your things brought from the inn, and they will provide you anything else you need." "Will I see you again?" I pleaded with him and threw my arms around his neck. "Before I leave for home. Go with the alderman." He pried my fingers from his clothes. "Be good. I love you, Lili," he said, abandoning me in a puddle on the floor. "Papa!" I cried as he left. "It's happening too fast. I can't stay here. I can't do this." The alderman scowled and crossed his arms. "Follow me." Not wanting to test the limits of his patience, I didn't wait for him to repeat himself. His descent of the dark flight of stairs was smooth and sure, but I fell behind. I braced myself on the rough stone walls on either side, searching for the step below. And reaching the landing, I quickened my pace to reach the halo of light surrounding the alderman as he stopped at a narrow door. "You will stay here until the king approves," he said, guiding me inside. "What do you mean until he approves?" I asked as he shut me in. I was more alone than I'd ever been, and my body shook as sweat beaded along my brow. "The king is unaware I'm here?" Moonlight streamed through a small window, illuminating the confined space. "The king is unaware I'm here?" Moonlight streamed through a small window, illuminating the confined space. Under it was a table and an undersized bed, where a delicate nightgown of white silk laid, something my mother would have worn. I changed my clothes, folding each piece with deliberate care, and placed them on a chair beside the water closet. A tear landed on the decadent cape, and I whimpered. I washed in the water basin and viewed myself in the mirror, but my face was lit in such a way that my imagination ran wild, seeing specters, and I panicked. I pulled at the door and banged my fists against the rough wood. It wouldn't budge, and no one came. Crying, I slumped to the floor. "Please let me out," I said, though I had nowhere to go. If I left, my father would disown me, which would make Elix happy. With that thought, my sobs relented. I let down my hair and finger-combed the silky waves around my shoulders as I stared out the small window, wondering how far away my father was. "Good night, Mother," I said to the stars, and pulled the shutters closed to keep out the frigid night air. Despite the strange creaks and the howl of the wind, exhaustion overtook me.